You conduct research into problem solving and learning, unconscious bias, cognitive functions, leadership diversity. You're interested in human brain plasticity and the malleable features of personality and intelligence, the highs and lows of ethical decision making. But what did you want to be when you were a kid?
Not an academic, that's for sure, right? I had aspirations of being a professional footballer.
Bob, would you mind moving into the mic
Right,
just a
sure,
little bit
yeah,
for us?
so-
Thanks.
So you wanted to be a professional footballer.
Yeah, I think we can leave that one behind now, Richard. I think it left me behind very quickly, yeah.
So how did you end up where you are? Because we're talking about intimacy and public, and I figure that getting you to talk to us intimately about how you ended up where you are in a public space.
Right, yes. Well, it's an interesting, and I think everybody has an interesting journey, and it was just, I started studying part-time and discovered that I liked it, and I was better at it than I had been at high school, and it just rolled on from there. And I've been an academic now for, dare I say it, 40 years, and love it.
Good. I was going to ask whether you loved it, because I know far too many people who end up in a career that they don't necessarily enjoy, but they stick with it for a variety of reasons. So
Right.
it's enriching for you.
Well, look, I think academia is an interesting, intimate public. You know, they're quite, and it's one that's changing quite significantly. But I think among academics, it's one of those jobs. If you like it, it's the best job in the world. If you don't like it, it's the worst job. And and one of the problems, I'm sure Larissa, you can vouch for this. You know, we always have colleagues who are part of our intimate public, but they've died a spiritual death. They can't let go of the identity, but they hate the work. And so dealing with that in a constructive way for people who are looking at it, I think, is a major challenge, I think, for academia, and one that is, from the very time when I began, where it was a respected and self-governing public and was much more intimate. It has certainly changed. I mean, government funding and budgeting processes, and so we deal with people who die this spiritual death in much more ruthless ways than we did when I was a much younger academic. And so,
In terms of intimacy itself, is intimacy something that is hardwired into us? Is a need for intimacy something that we're born with? Or is it a trait that we learn?
it's a good question. I mean, I think from a psychological perspective, the intimacy with humans, there's a push element and there's a pull element. I mean, I think people crave attachment. I mean, that's part of the human condition. In fact, one of the big predictors of sort of mental problems is a lack of attachment and a lack of intimacy. And so we've seen, you know, historically these cases of babies who lack, physical contact very young develop quite bad psychological disorders. But at the same time, I mean, if you think about public intimacy, we have highly defined limits about what spaces are. So when I was a PhD student, we learned intimacy was up to 1.5 feet. And I'm serious about this. And if you invade, more than 1.5 feet, it's an intimate act.
Right.
And whereas a sort of more of a personal space, close enough to touch, but not physically in my space, is out to about 4 feet. And then social space goes out to 12 feet and public space is beyond 12 feet. And so these are very well defined. They vary from culture to culture, but they're very well understood. I mean, you just do this experience. I mean, I could get up now and walk over to Larissa and stand very close to her and hold her hand and continue to hold it beyond a normal handshake. And I can see she's cringing already at the thought that
No,
God,
I think she's into it, Bob.
don't get off that chair, right? These are really well-defined aspects in society that they vary from society to society, but
Culturally, is there one culture that stands out that can deal with being, that up close?
well, Latin cultures allow intimate space. You can stand close enough to absorb a person's spit in a Latin culture, but you cannot in an Anglo culture. So if I came here, for example, and sat very close to Richard like this and stood here the whole time, a certain nervousness would, maybe not with Richard, he's a pretty cool dude, so he probably would
So what you're saying then is our definitions of intimacy are permeable and flexible. They're not set in our culture, but they're defined in a wider sense by the culture we live in.
Yeah. Well, how much of it's hardwired and how much of it is learned? I suspect the cultural differences suggest that it is learned. There's sets of conventions, and so as a child you start to learn. It's just like children learn at a certain age it's not permissible to run around naked. That just suddenly happens, right? It usually happens when their elder brothers or sisters bring teenage friends home or something. Though we lived in the US for many years, and we discovered our children were in 4 and 5, and they used to run around naked in the backyard, and our neighbours complained. They said it was inappropriate, whereas in Australia, I don't think anybody would be worried. So people have different conventions around these things. But can I just make one I just want to pick up what Larissa said about, she gave a really succinct definition of what an intimate public was, and it struck me listening to her. It sort of sat somewhere between a sort of a crowd and a tribe. And I think one of the risks of an intimate public is it becomes more like a tribe. The skin gets tighter and more well defined, and so what we end up with is we don't get all the benefits of diversity and learning and experience that we expect. What we get is an insularity, so we get more and more intimate publics that are not connecting. And I think one of the big challenges for our politicians and our public spaces is how do you create public spaces where a lot of intimate publics go into public spaces for performance purposes. It's to make a point. I was walking through Federation Square one day, and there was a protest going on. It was about some maltreatment of people in India, and so this was an intimate public who had gathered, but they were quite insular. I mean, there is also how do you get people connecting in public spaces, and that's got issues of.
That's something I really wanted to ask you about, actually, and I wondered whether it's partially psychological, partially architectural, and so forth. Our brains are wired to adapt to our environment.
Right. Yeah.
So, in what sense does the environment that surrounds us, the cityscape, can we reconfigure that? Can we adapt that to facilitate and encourage greater intimacy? And if so, how could we do that?
Well, I'm not an architect, but I hope the answer is yes, very much so, because otherwise we're in trouble. I mean, I think there's a lot of research in rats when we study brains. People look at rats, and if you put rats in a very bland environment, their brain development is quite impeded. You put them in an enriched environment where they interact with other animals and they have little things to run on and stuff. Their brain development is quite rich. And while we can't run similar experiments on humans, some say unfortunately, but before ethics committees, people would consider it, I think. But this idea of creating rich environments, but keep in mind, diversity is an opportunity, but it's also a potential threat for people, and so it can lead to insularity. Like you pull back in under the threat of diversity, or you engage with it. And so I think public spaces need to sort of do something about that connectedness, so people can engage in a meaningful way. And I think that's probably got to do with the amount of time you spend there, the pressure that if everybody's pushed into less than 1.5 feet, it's too intimate to process in the moment. I have great respect for architects and their ability to design those spaces, but they are critical to the developments of our brains. Social development is major contributor to our brain development. Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about when I was pondering that question of changing our physical space and the impact that could have on us was, and I know you're not an architect, but we're seeing a blurring of public and private space. We're seeing an increasing blurring of, from my perspective as an arts critic, we're seeing a blurring of art form boundaries.
Right.
Are we also seeing a blurring of professional and scientific boundaries as well?
Very much so. In fact, I think of my career, what's changed radically is that the intimate public that were academics, which were sort of a very closely held union, and that's changed radically. And so the expectation of engaging with the public, Larissa's here today, and her research is pretty esoteric, but it has a very applied. It's not just a question of what works and why it's interesting, but why it works, but what works. And I think our experience certainly has been, we need to engage with many different stakeholders, and it comes down to, and so social media has become quite important as a way of getting messages out, and I think that can often lead, it ends up creating two tribes. It's the public performer. It becomes a I think one of the big risks is it becomes a performance space rather than a connecting space, and I think a lot of academics have fallen into that trap and made claims that have gone beyond what their research sustains.
Tell us a little bit more about that. I'm curious, the notion of performance through social media can have a number of meanings, but be a bit more specific for us about what you're talking about.
When I was thinking about, I have to say, I really taxed my mind. I sort of got stuck on public intimacy, which I thought we were talking about, and then intimate publics, and I thought, wow, it turns out these... if we want to have another session, I can talk about the thing I thought about. So what I did think about public spaces, and I thought about my own experiences, and I thought, well, maybe when we're in a public space, there's one of three things going on. One is it's a performance. There's social comparison. You're concerned about what other people think. You're thinking about what you're doing. There's connecting, and that's what I think we mean by getting these intimate. So we're engaging with other people. It may be in direct dialogue, or it may just be by being part of a tribe or a group that's gathered. But then there's just a sense of being, and in psychology, we have this construct called intrinsic motivation, and it's a rather simple idea. The idea is your motivation and enjoyment just comes from the task itself. There's no other intervention. You don't need recognition. There's no social comparison. So reading a book is could be a form of intrinsic motivation. You lose yourself in it, and I think connectedness has elements of intrinsic. Being reward. You don't keep connecting if the person doesn't respond. Whereas this sense of being, I think. There's quite places for quiet contemplation. If I could give you a personal example, I was given a Fitbit for Christmas. I have to say. It was a sort of slight hint, and one of these things that this is a bit of extrinsic. I don't have it on today, right?
I've got mine on.
Right,
I'm afraid,
but it prompts you to do steps. So I've started walking at lunchtime, and I have my office at Melbourne University. It's not very far from the cemetery, and so I walked into the cemetery one day, and as I was standing looking at the board, I saw that Paddy Hannon is buried in Melbourne Cemetery. Does anybody know who Paddy Hannon is? There you go, right? So this is an intimate moment for me. Paddy Hannon found gold that led to the discovery of Kalgoorlie. And I was born and grew up in Kalgoorlie. So
wow.
I walked and found his grave, and I stood there, and it had a little sign saying "restored by friends from Kalgoorlie Boulder," and it's quite. I've gone back there quite a bit, and I've started reading more about Paddy Hannon, and which when I was in high school I thought was a total bore. But I was sort of reflecting on that. It's a sort of intimate moment with a dead person, in a
very public space.
In a very public space, and as I've spent more time in the cemetery, I really have come to realise it's a place for being and connecting. They're quite strong morals. Like I was there one day, and a group of kids were skateboarding through, and some other people who really took umbrage at this. This was a sense you're breaking some moral code here. So it's quite a I don't know if architects design cemeteries for this, but that's a sort of interesting phenomena.
I'm sure on the template a skateboarding ramp wasn't included in the cemetery planning spirit.
Look, and in terms of then that permeability and the mutability between the public and private, social media is the classic example that people keep talking about. It's something that connects us, but simultaneously distances us when we spend more time kind of mediating the world through a screen or a keyboard. And do you think that will have an impact on our brains? How is that going to affect our brains, that kind of distancing effect of social media and the use of social media? I'm sitting here with a mobile device in my hand. All my questions are written down here. But how is using devices like this, do you think, going to impact on our brains, on the structure and the way of our brains and the way we think in 20, 50 years' time? Is it possible to theorise?
Well, I think it definitely is, and some of it will be good and some of it will be bad, right? So first of all, the high levels of interactivity and visual, and you were talking about first shooter games. If you take the shooting component, they actually are very good for developing visuospatial skills, which is one of the arguments why, when I was a PhD student, we were told that the one marker test in intelligence that was significantly different between boys and girls was visuospatial skills, right? Now that's been disproven. It's basically, as a young boy, you play a lot of first-person shooter games. This is running around war games, and they require quite strong visuospatial skills. If you train girls on video games, their visuospatial skills on marker tests are the same. So there's a lot of evidence that these games. The problem is the content. So if it's also teaching you to run around and bash up people and think that killing people is okay, then that's the knowledge part, which is not so good. So you become a much more sophisticated, high reflex, good visuospatial killer, that's the risk. It was all good up to that point, and we do know from research in social modelling that if children are exposed to violence, they become, I did my PhD, my postdoc with Al Bandura, and he did these famous studies on the Bobo dolls, where you show children, punching dolls, and it alters their behaviour. So if you see violence being modelled, and governments know this, intergenerational effects of domestic violence and family violence. So it's a very complex question. I think there is good. We run brain training activities, so clearly I think they have a positive effect, but they're relatively content-free. But just one final comment, sorry it's a bit long, but the social media thing is interesting because what we do know, I mean, if you want to maintain a healthy brain, eat a good diet, exercise, and interact with people in a meaningful, engaging way. That'll beat it, and do the occasional crossword and Sudoku puzzle. That will beat brain training any day.
That's a great message too.
Yeah. So
thank you, Bob.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We're going to pass the baton, and Richard, would you please thank Richard?